Green Spring. Today is Wednesday, January 3rd, 2018. I'm Fran Duvall, your host for today, and here for our quarterly visit with Len Kalkwalf, talking about presidential libraries. And this week it is Len, you're on.
We're going to talk about Ronald Reagan, the 40th president, and this is in proper historical sequence because we are taking each president as they served in office. So now we've reached this particular point. And he was president from 1981 to 1989, and he's still being held up as one of the great popular presidents. And there are those who feel that in order to run for political office, they have to emulate him and say that they are in the footsteps of Ronald Reagan. Maybe if they saw some of his accomplishments, they would not necessarily say that. But anyway, we're going to talk about that a bit. He's regarded by many as being the great conservative. I want to give my impression of his presidency, and I do that from the standpoint of some of the things I've read, some of the things that I remember during the time that he was president, and also my visit to his presidential library. So, but from there we'll go on. First of all, I'd like to show some pictures of his presidential library, and we'll just rush through those a bit as we can see some of the things that he did, what he showed in his library.
Well, you told me once that this was one of the most impressive sites.
Yes, and it was, I would say, is probably the largest of all of his presidential libraries.
Okay.
And I think you'll sense that as we see some of the pictures coming up. It's in a beautiful setting. Covers 100, I think a little over 100 acres.
Wow.
And if you have any idea what an acre is only 200 by 200 feet. And so you multiply that, it's 100 acres. So. And it's on the top of a mountain. And the scenery is absolutely beautiful, just gorgeous.
Len, was that where he was born?
No, well, he was born actually in Illinois.
Oh, okay.
And
well,
he ends up later on having a ranch out there.
Well,
this is a view from his library, looking over the mountains and valley, and it is absolutely gorgeous. And when you go up to his particular library, you go up a mountain and you see all of the flags of previous presidents. And then as you walk to his library, you walk along a path, and it's all flowers on both sides of the sidewalk. And it's just gorgeous. There's no question about it. Beautiful sight.
Well, California itself is beautiful.
Yes, California is obviously very beautiful. This is just showing the entrance to his library. This is the library itself. I don't feel that it's a great looking building, but it's kind of a ranch style, very large, and this is the primary entrance to the library.
Was it white stucco? Is that what it was? The material?
I don't remember what it was or not.
Okay.
And these are some of the signs inside as a reminder of what he did. And he talks about him being the great communicator, which obviously he was. He was one who was able to speak and speak fluently. Appreciated that. Other signs, for example, throughout the library. A reminder when he was on General Electric Theater. This is all kind of a summary of his life, both where he was born and his experience as the governor in California for 2 terms, and then when he became president and so on.
It doesn't deal with any of his acting or his Hollywood stuff?
A little bit, yeah, a little bit. Yeah, and there's a lot of all of the libraries. I would say that this is one where you see the principle more and more than any other place. For example, Jimmy Carter, you hardly see Jimmy Carter. You see the things that he accomplished, but you don't see much about Jimmy Carter.
You mean his image or his photograph?
His image and all that.
I see.
Here it is all Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan, over and over again, almost to the point of being too much in your face type of thing. And these, again, some of the statements that he made and so on. Okay. You can probably read this better off the TV than we can here. And this is one of his statements
Oh,
that
yeah.
he made in order to become elected. Are you better off than you were 4 years
Yeah,
ago?
that was a slogan that he
That was a
used,
slogan,
yeah.
and was very helpful for him becoming elected as president. I talked about the great debate. And here again is one of the examples that I was talking about. You see him all the time. Here's a big statue of Reagan in the hallway. You couldn't avoid him, for example, as you walk from one room to the other. And I found that a little bit much.
It was different from other libraries then.
Yeah, very much so. I felt, at least. And here is an example of how large this particular building is. This is Air Force One.
Wow.
Inside the building. In addition to that is Marine One, the helicopter, and the Secret Service cars as well. So it is a huge, huge room. There's a helicopter.
A football stadium size.
Yes, oh yes, it was. And Reagan traveled a tremendous amount, and his was more of a one-to-one diplomacy. In the back of the building is a piece of the wall from the wall that Gorbachev finally took down.
Yeah. So that's part of the Berlin Wall.
For the Berlin Wall. Okay, that may be the extent of the pictures that I have. It was an interesting experience, and to be there, for example. But I'd like to talk a bit about the man and some of his accomplishments and some of the things that he tried to do. Let me just mention that he was born in Illinois in 1911. He was Irish Catholic. His father was an alcoholic. He loved sports. And one of the things that he loved was football, and he played football.
Yeah.
But as a result of playing football, he had a lifelong problem with claustrophobia, because he found himself on the bottom of the piles oftentimes. And he said that this really affected him. So, well, okay.
That's funny.
He was a lifeguard, and as a lifeguard, he said it was a job that he really liked because it was like being on stage, because he was up there and people had to look up to him, and it was almost like he was acting and so on. However, in the 6 years, I think it was 6 years that he served as a lifeguard, he rescued 77 people. And he said that only one person ever came back to thank him, and that person was a blind man. But nobody else ever came back to thank him. And he felt the reason they didn't do it because they were embarrassed that they had to be saved, for example. So
Because they had done something foolish. Maybe.
yeah. So, but anyway, he went to a small college out in the Midwest. He was not a good student. He got very poor grades. He had difficulty passing tests. But then what he did, he had an ability to memorize, and so the night before the test, he would just memorize everything. The next day, he was able to pass the test, but then he didn't necessarily remember what he had memorized. The real passion that he had was to be in the theater. He wanted to be in the acting. But the interesting thing is about Reagan, he was a very strong supporter of FDR. A Democrat, because the Democrats, especially FDR's program, had helped it save his family during the Depression.
Sure.
And so he was a very fervent a member of the Democratic Party. Also, his parents had rejected racism, and this obviously rubbed off on him, because when they were playing football and they went to different towns, for example, one time 2 of the black players were rejected to stay in a motel or a hotel. And so what Reagan did is he took them home to their house. So you see his attitude toward race. In adulthood, what was interesting about him was that he began in radio. Apparently his voice was very conducive to radio. He was a natural storyteller, and I remember growing up out in Iowa, there were 2 radio stations that we listened to. One was in Yankton, South Dakota, and the other one was WHO in Des Moines, Iowa. And I kind of grew up on WHO in Des Moines, and that's where Reagan began as a sports commentator. So I don't know this, but I probably heard him many, many times as I was growing up, not aware of who he was, not aware at all.
Okay.
And his name didn't mean anything to me at all. He wanted to be in the movies, and he got a job with Warner Brothers, which lasted for some 15 years. He made 41 films. During that time, he married Jane Wyman, who was a movie star and whose career actually went far beyond his, and they got divorced later on. He played in the movie Newt Rockne, the All-American, and he created the expression. This is apparently something that Reagan created, save one for the Gipper.
Yeah.
It was not obviously prior to that time. In 1942, he was drafted. He had been serving, I think, in the Iowa National Guard for a while.
Iowa?
Yeah, while he was at WHO in Des Moines, you see.
Okay.
Yeah, and then he was not being drafted until 1942, but because of his poor eyesight, he was assigned to limited service, and his job was to make recruiting films, which he did. When he got out of the service, by that time his career was no longer on the ups, and so he had to find something else. He became a board member of the Actors Guild,
Right.
and he averted a strike, and apparently that kind of leadership propelled him, and he became very popular because of that. He also was concerned about the communists taking over. Now, this is the days, if you remember, anybody living through that day remembers how people saw communists under every leaf that was there. And he helped, he agreed with the federal government in terms of revealing those who might be communist in the movie industry. So he was cooperating with them.
With the blacklist people.
Yeah, and then when the time came for elections, he was a one who supported Harry Truman. Here's another Democrat he was supporting. Then when Eisenhower was running for president, he was one of the Democrats for Ike.
Okay,
Yeah, okay. Now, by this time, he had divorced Jane Wyman, and he remarried. He married Nancy Davis, who was also an actress. And I mention this because she grew up in a very conservative political home, and this had a real influence upon him, as I'll mention a little bit later. By this time, he was dropped by Warner Brothers because he was no longer popular, and he worked in a nightclub in Las Vegas, which he didn't like. And then he got a job with General Electric, and I think many of us remember the General Electric Theater, where he was the spokesman. And I can still picture him standing there at the bottom of the stairway speaking and so on. And again, I think this made him a very popular person. At least a large number of people began to know who he was.
Yes.
His outlook changed during this time drastically. He had been a very liberal, obviously, voting for Democrats. Then, because he was working for General Electric, even after being the spokesman on General Electric Theater, he was sent to different General Electric plants. And he would speak to the executives and to various people working for General Electric. And they would tell him what they didn't like about the government, and how the government regulations and so on were hampering General Electric. And he began to change in terms of his attitude regarding government and so on. That plus Nancy's very conservative outlook made him change really from a real liberal to almost a right-winger. Now, he becomes the opposite of FDR. Now, FDR believed that taxation and regulation were very necessary and very important, and that corporations had to be the servants. He began to see that taxation and regulation were really the villains, and that corporations and markets were his heroes. So he had changed very, very much. And he also saw that the primary threat to individual liberty was the government. Now, his major change comes in his famous endorsement of Barry Goldwater in 1964. You may remember his TV address was "Time for Choosing." Now, he did not start the conservative movement. The conservative movement had been in existence for some time. It had a lot of fringe groups. For example, the John Birch Society and other hate groups and so on were all part of this conservative. And William Buckley was probably the one who becomes the intellectual, who intellectualizes the conservative movement, and Reagan latches on to that. Of course, Barry Goldwater was not elected, but by him endorsing him and people seeing how charismatic he was, they felt that he would make a good politician. So he ran for governor of California, served for 2 terms.
What are their terms there, 4 years?
I believe so,
Okay.
yes. And then because Gerald Ford nearly missed getting the nomination, and because of Carter's problems at that time, he becomes the nominee of the Republican Party and becomes elected as president. Now, I'd like to mention a couple of things about his philosophy, the Reaganomics. There are 4 things that he really stood for, and they're not so surprising at all. Number 1, reduce taxes. Number 2, cut domestic spending. 3, deregulation. And 4, use the monetary policy to combat inflation. And they sound very much of the Republican Party. And these were his strong points that he was trying to do. 2 men were involved in his presidency that we have to mention because they had a major influence, really, and I think names that we will remember. One was David Stockman, who was his budget director. And Stockman was a young man, but he was enlisted by Reagan to balance the budget. But Reagan would not cut enough of the budget to be able to balance it, and Stockman kept telling him that. But Stockman said that Reagan just did not seemingly hear. So finally, in order to present a balanced budget, he put an asterisk beside any number of items and saying, to be dealt with later, to be dealt with later, and so on. And finally, of course, Stockman resigned and so on. But he was very much involved in that.
I can picture him, Stockman.
A young guy. Yeah. The other one is a man by the name of Arthur Layford, and talked about the Layford curve. And his point was that if you cut enough of the budget, for example, and give the tax increases to the rich, then it will trickle down. It's the trickle-down economics, very much that George H.W. Bush later on was proposed. Well, it didn't work, and it never seemed to have worked. Now, one of his objectives, and he was very emphatic about this, and by the way, I see a lot of parallels, Reagan's presidency and Trump's presidency.
Well, I'm hearing them as you speak.
Yeah. Well, his one objective was to undo LBJ's Great Society. Now, I think it's always dangerous to be so emphatic about that, because in doing that you do away with a lot of the good things that have taken place. But that was his objective. Now, what he did in order to undo the Great Society was, number 1, make cuts in Social Security. Number 2, cuts in Medicare and Medicaid, and increase the military spending by 7%. Now, he was not really successful in being able to undo the Great Society because as a result of what he was doing, child poverty rate increased from 16 to 20%. The homelessness was now a new epidemic. The recession deepened, and the deficit projection got worse every year. The Dow fell some 20%, and unemployment rose to a peak of 10.8%. Now, his approval rating, and we always think of him as being a very popular president, but his approval rating fell from 68% in May of 1981 to 35% in January of 1983. Now, things got better in the beginning of the second term, but this was kind of an indication of what was happening. And then at that particular point, we have one of the major scandals, and the Ira Conqueror scandal with Oliver North, who I think never went to trial because he got immunity from the Congress. Probably should have gone to trial, but anyway. And then the other thing is that 17% of his aides were convicted of wrongdoing, including his former Secretary of the Interior, his executive assistant, for defrauding the government, for bribery, and lying to Congress.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, doesn't sound too good.
Sounds pretty bad.
By the way, this is the interesting thing in the library, in Reagan's library, it's supposed to be balanced. I found this particular library to be one of the most unbalanced libraries of all. Clinton, for example, they have there about Lewinsky and so on. I would say all of the libraries are far more balanced. Even Herbert Hoover talking about the Depression and what he tried to do and so on, and where he failed, where he was trying to get volunteers to be responsible rather than the government. It goes into detail about that, but these things are not mentioned at Reagan's library.
You mean the Iran-Contra
and
Oliver North are not mentioned?
Right. I don't remember any of that.
Interesting.
Nor the number of people that went to prison, nor the large deficit that Reagan left at the end. But some will argue about that.
Now,
but
can I interrupt and just ask, is his one of the libraries that's on the actual national thing? Yeah,
this is one of the 13. Okay. Oh, yes. And it's supposed to be balanced.
Okay.
Personally, I didn't find it that balanced, but okay. Now, I'd like to summarize some of the things that I've said. Number one, he was not the most popular president, even though many would today still say he was. In fact, in the last 50 years, he rates third in terms of popularity, after that of JFK and Bill Clinton. 1/3 of the Americans wanted him to resign toward the end of his term. Now, his approval rating climbed a bit after that people found out that he had Alzheimer's, and also when the Republican Party worked so hard to change the national airport here in Washington and make it Washington. I mean, make it Reagan National. So his popularity climbed a bit then. Number two, he was not really a tax cutter. He did cut, and of course he had to pay a very high income tax when he was in the movies. And that always apparently was one of the motivation for him. And he cut the marginal rate from 70% to 50% in 1981. Although there were big breaks for the corporations in the oil industry and the richest people. However, when the economy began to go a bit sour, he started raising taxes, not necessarily the income tax, but he added taxes. Gasoline tax and so on went up. Okay.
Right.
and blue-collar people were paid a higher rate of taxes when he left office than when he entered office. So he was not a real tax cutter. He didn't shrink the federal government that much. He's the one that said that government is not the solution to our problems, it is the problem. It's interesting that every year he increased the size of the federal government.
Interesting.
And you'll see, it's kind of ironic, but the Reagan building in D.C. is the most expensive federal building ever built. And it kind of pays tribute to Reagan's large federal government. What he did do, and where he had a tremendous influence, he appointed Scalia to the Supreme Court. And at the same time, the lower level of the judiciary was changed with a lot of very conservative people. And so they moved reversing maybe decades of liberal drift. And the other thing was that he was not that much of a cultural warrior. He spoke against abortion, but he proposed no legislation against abortion. In fact, when he was in the government, the governor of California, he legalized abortion. And he also advocated prayer in the public school, but never proposed any legislation for it. He was not a scholar, and the evidence he often presented was kind of bogus. For example, he would present facts from John Birch Society or the Nazi pamphlets or places like the Inquiry, and when these were not real facts, but he presented these as facts, for example.
Yeah, his sources were questionable, huh?
Very questionable, yeah. Okay, I do want to say something very positive about him. And I think this is the thing that people remember, that he had a very sunny disposition. He was likable. He was a great storyteller. In many ways, he was like JFK. And he also governed in a different way. Like, for example, some of the men found the presidency to be such a burden. Jimmy Carter, for example, just was overwhelmed by it because he was dealing with every little detail. Not Reagan. He was more like a CEO, chief executive officer, who left his staff people do the work, and then he made his decisions based on that. The other thing I would say is that in many ways, Reagan was one of a kind. He was a unique individual. People liked him because of what he was, for example. So that kind of wraps up my overall summary.
Well, I'll tell you, you really covered a lot in the correct amount of time, I might say.
Oh, well, I hope so.
But seriously, I think you gave, whether the library is balanced, you gave a balance, I think, to this. Thank you, Len, very much.